Pokemon. It's always been a big part of my childhood. In fact, the very first Pokemon game I ever owned was Diamond, and that was the gateway that led me to go and get Pokemon Platinum, Heart Gold, White, and Black 2. Then, finally, Pokemon Sun. And since then, I'm yet to play any new addition to the Pokemon franchise. Now, across the games that I have played, their structure has stayed fairly similar. You get your starter, fight your rival, challenge gym leaders or totem Pokemon in one case, rinse and repeat until you face off against the quote-unquote evil team, defeat the Elite Four, and finally, the champion. And that's fine. It's essentially what Pokemon is known for. You don't need to reinvent the wheel. And for me, I was also fine with this. That is until I got Pokemon Mystery Dungeon. More specifically though, Pokemon Mystery Dungeon Explorers of Time. Now, there are many aspects I would love to talk about and compare to the mainline series, but today I want to focus on one thing in particular, and that is how combat is made distinctive in the Mystery Dungeon games. And for clarity, when I say Mystery Dungeon, I'm specifically talking about Explorers of Time, Darkness, and Sky, as those are the ones I've currently played so far. Firstly, what do we know about the combat in Pokemon? Well, there's the basics of Pokemon types, where each has their own strengths and weaknesses, which essentially plays out like a massive game of rock, paper, scissors, with extra types of rocks, papers, and, well, scissors. Then, once we're actually in battle, one Pokemon uses a move, then it's the other Pokemon's turn, kind of like a slap fight, but with other tactical decisions, apart from just slapping each other harder with more powerful moves. And speaking of moves, the game follows a standard JRPG recipe, where most of the time, the moves you learn early on in the game are quite weak, and you gradually have access to more powerful moves as your Pokemon's level increases. Using Cyndaquil as an example here with just the fire-type moves it learns, the first move it learns is Ember with a base damage of 40 and an accuracy of 100%. Next up is Flame Wheel, the same accuracy but a higher base damage being 60. Problem is though, it's based on the user's attack stat rather than special attack stat, which is what the Cyndaquil evolution line prefers. Luckily, it learns Lava Plume, Flamethrower, and Eruption, all of which deal more damage whilst having the same accuracy. Just a quick side note though with Eruption, it's actually based on how healthy the Pokemon is, so after a certain threshold it does deal less damage than Ember. So, when it comes to the raw stats, it's very easy to see why a lot of us would choose any other fire-type move over Ember as we level up. However, for Mystery Dungeon, the game makes a couple of changes to the stats which affects our decision making. Firstly, accuracy. Apart from moves that could always hit, such as Aerial Ace and Shadow Punch, all moves as far as I know now actually have a chance to miss. For example, Ember, as mentioned before, had a base 100% chance to hit, but in Mystery Dungeon it now has an 88% chance to hit. Meanwhile, Flamethrower, while still doing more damage as well, now has a lower accuracy than Ember with 83.6%. And that isn't the only change. No. They adjusted the power points for pretty much every single move. In fact, I'm pretty sure they just lowered every single move's power points. Anyway, Water Gun and Ember each had 25 PP in the main games. Water Gun now has 17 PP and Ember 15 PP. But the biggest and most impactful factor for this change in particular is the existence of Pokemon Centers. In pretty much any town or city, there's going to be a Pokemon Center or the equivalent of one, such as the bed that you share with your mum in some games. The problem with that is that it always gives the player a reliable location to restock on the HP and PP, so the threat of running out just really wasn't there. So unless you're in an area like Victory Road where there's long stretches of land and you're expected to beat a whole bunch of trainers, management of PP just wasn't too much of a hassle. I'm saying PP a lot. Now, I know there are some Nuzlocke rules out there which restrict the amount of times you use the Pokemon Center to add difficulty to the game, and that's fine, you can play however you want. These are self-imposed challenges. However, when it isn't a choice and it is part of the game, that is a self-contained challenge, and that is what Mystery Dungeon has to deal with. Instead, you have to complete the dungeon in one go relying on the minimal amount of PP you have. Some dungeons, however, do have checkpoints which allow you to refresh PP and save your progress, but as you go further in the story, the dungeons become more difficult and the amount of floors in between these checkpoints usually increase. Therefore, when it comes to move selection, not only are the damage and accuracy numbers something you need to consider, but also the amount of PP the move has. There's another further thing that differs between moves, but I'll get to that in a bit. It also doesn't help that super effective moves and critical hits don't actually deal 2 times the amount of damage like they do in the mainline games. No, it's a different amount. I have tried to search different websites for an exact number. None of them seem to agree how much the multiplier is exactly, but they do seem to agree that it no longer is 2 times the amount anymore. That's about all I have to say about the moves based on their raw numbers, but how do the moves work from a gameplay point of view? More specifically though, their range. In the mainline games, some of the main variations of Pokemon battles were 1v1s, 2v2s and 3v3s. We don't talk about rotation battles here. In 1v1s, there isn't really much of a range, as the only viable targets are the opponents or yourself, as you can use moves that buff your stats on yourself and offensive moves to opponents. Then when it moves on to 2v2s and 3v3s, it adds some variation on how some moves affect other Pokemon. The best examples from memory are moves like Rock Slide, which in 2v2s hits both opponent Pokemon, moves like Earthquake hits every Pokemon around you, and moves like Helping Hand, which helps buff your teammates. Then when it comes to the set pieces, Pokemon battles take place in a sort of phantom zone where only the Pokemon are present and it feels like they're just there to fight each other. But for Mystery Dungeon, the game takes place on a bunch of tiles, kind of like XCOM or Fire Emblem, and this is where the main difference on combat comes into play, as positioning is also now part of combat. Look, it's on a 2D plane, baby. We can move up, down, left and right. But how does this affect battle? Well, moves now have an actual range dictated by tiles in the game. A lot of moves only affect Pokemon that are directly in front of you, however. Some can hit around corners, which is exactly the same as before, but it just doesn't count the edge of a wall as a big enough obstacle to stop you from hitting them. Additionally, the tile system has caused some moves to be changed entirely, as it didn't make sense on this tile-based system. My favourite example is Whirlwind. With wild Pokemon, it used to just stop the battle entirely. In trainer battles, it used to forcibly swap the Pokemon. But with this system, it throws the Pokemon that is directly in front of you away. If they collide with terrain, they take damage. But if they collide with another Pokemon, both Pokemon take damage. Now, these move ranges are quite simple, and alongside that, there's also a strategy which utilises the lack of range from said moves. The game doesn't go out of its way to tell you, however, but you can find it by yourself in one of the rooms in the guild. In them, there is a small book. That book is actually Bidooff's diary, and one of the entries says this. It turns out Sunflora is a real expert at fighting in dungeons. When an enemy is just out of reach, she doesn't move towards it. Instead, she uses A to launch her regular attack. That's right, they literally say A rather than, just hit. Striking at nothing. Then, the enemy usually spends that turn closing the distance on her. And then, on her next turn, she's the first one close enough to hit. So, because of this adds yet another layer of pseudo strategy when it comes to positioning yourself, and whether intentional or not, I absolutely loved it. But you have to be careful. This strategy is not perfect, because it kind of relies on the idea that the Pokemon you're up against only has moves that affect Pokemon directly in front of them. The next type of moves I'm going to talk about completely break this strategy, and these are the priority moves. Moves like Quick Attack, Bullet Punch, Extreme Speed. Rather than having one tile, they can hit up to 2 tiles, and that is shown in the example here with Starly. We press A, we hit the air, Starly looks at us, perplexed, and hits us with a Quick Attack. But despite the fact it kind of breaks the whole point of that previous strategy, it's still good. Because it makes you think, do you decide to actually close the gap yourself and take the hit if they use a move? Or do you take the risk and hope they don't have a priority move and allow them to get closer? I honestly love this game. Oh yeah, one other cool thing about priority moves is that if you have an ally sandwiched between you and an opponent, if you use a priority move, it skips your ally as a viable target and just hits the opponent, which allows you to position yourself to be safe from the opponent and still hit them. Also, it cuts corners, so that's another cool thing. Moves that buff stats don't usually require a target anymore, and it either uses it on yourself or the entire team. Such as Helping Hand, which used to affect one teammate in the mainline games, but now affects the entire team in Mystery Dungeon. Some moves require a line of sight, If you can see an opponent and draw a direct line of tiles to them, you can hit them. They're 2 tiles away, you can hit them. There's a corner in the way, you can hit them. You're all the way in Paris, and they're on the moon. You can still hit. Actually, no you can't. When I was checking the ranges on the wiki, it stated 10 tiles, which I didn't believe, but I decided to actually test it when I was going through Explorers of Time again. But it legit is 10 tiles. It just stops after that. This causes you to consider the range of a move when selecting whether you learn it, remove it, or replace it. Moreover, there are still some moves that damage adjacent Pokemon in standard Pokemon battles, such as Lava Plume and Discharge. Despite them being basically the same move with different typings in the mainline games, these two examples work differently in Mystery Dungeon. Lava Plume has a 1 tile range, but hits every Pokemon within that range. So if Cyndaquil were cornered by Pokemon on all 8 tiles around them, Lava Plume can hit all of them. Meanwhile, Discharge gets a really big super buff to it, where it hits every Pokemon that is in the same room, regardless of the size of the room. But in a small corridor though, it's restricted to the small bubble of vision around the Pokemon, so it's only used in that area. And let me tell you this is the bane of balancing issues this game faces, especially when you're dealing with a Pokemon that has access to one of these moves. You'll be tempted to punch a wall when a random Venomoth decides it's going to be really funny to spam Silver Wind every step you take. The best thing about Silver Wind as well is there's a small chance it can buff its own stats, which in turn can increase its speed, and with its speed increased, can use Silver Wind more often in between your turns. It is really fun. If I were to rework this, I'd probably do something simple like it has a radius of damage rather than affecting the entire room. I have no idea what they were thinking with that. That is an insane decision to have it affect the entirety of the room. It's ridiculous. But that begs the question, why would they introduce a move with a range like that? Because when you go through dungeons, there's not that many Pokemon in them. Maybe 1 or 2 during a small corridor or even a small room. Surely you don't deal with that many Pokemon, right? Right? For anybody that's played the Pokemon Mystery Dungeon series, they probably know what this theme is. If you don't, that's the Monster House theme. I know that's not the animated film, it's this. A whole bunch of Pokemon just spawn in, and you're expected to fight your way out. Being introduced to this as a kid was genuinely scary. It was something Pokemon never did to me before, and I felt betrayed. Thankfully, with the introduction of varied move ranges, it makes dealing with monster houses, or just a lot of Pokemon in general, easier and more varied. For example, if you have a Pokemon that can use Discharge, they can deal damage to every Pokemon in the room, while everyone else picks off Pokemon that are close to them. And this itself is why I truly love the combat in Mystery Dungeon, because I felt more accustomed to these ones, and that's probably why I enjoy games like Fire Emblem and XCOM now. This also makes combat feel a lot more like a group effort, and to me feels akin to a set piece from a movie or TV show where you and your team have to overcome a numbers disadvantage. The best thing is, this is even limited to the standard dungeon part of the game. There are some boss fights where you are actually outnumbered. In fact, this boss fight in particular, when you're up against a Luxray and 8, I repeat, 8 Luxios, was one of the reasons why I'm making this video in the first place. One thing to note is that Explorers of the Sky actually added some quality of life changes to jobs. Jobs act as side quests, and they are the in-game reason as to why your team would revisit dungeons you've already cleared. One of these changes includes the addition of jobs which give a hint that the Pokemon, the bounty Pokemon that is, has henchmen, work in a group, or some sort of trap setup. Then, when you reach the floor that they're on, a trap is sprung. The trap itself? It's a monster house. That's right, the game made optional side quests include subjecting yourself to dealing with monster houses, and that is something I absolutely love. But that isn't the only type of encounter you'll find. In some of the boss fights and jobs, you may be tasked to deal with Pokemon where you outnumber them. Sounds good, right? Well, it would be if they weren't so bulky. When replaying Explorers of Time, I was genuinely surprised at how many turns it took us to deal with Groudon, purely because of how much HP it had. Pair that with its moveset, which can deal a lot of damage back, and it becomes a problem. So how do we overcome this? Type advantage is one option, but the game has also considered the scenario where you choose a Pokemon and a partner Pokemon which doesn't have a moveset, a natural moveset, which can deal with ground types. One way to deal with them is with major status effects. Just like the mainline series, the status effects act in a similar or same way. Sleep acts pretty much exactly the same way as before, where you can't do anything until you get woken up. Burn also seems to be unchanged, where it deals damage over time, and also reduces the attack stats of the inflicted Pokemon. Some interactions have been altered for Mystery Dungeon. For example, poisoned/badly poisoned still deals damage over time, as well as the added effect of stopping natural health regeneration. For paralysis, it affects your travel speed, and definitely stops any attack, regular or special, and realistically the only thing you can do is throw particular items. Again, we'll get to that in a bit. Then finally, freeze. This one's actually pretty cool because you can't perform any action at all, kind of like sleep. You can't attack anything at all, but at the same time you can't be damaged until you've been thawed out. It should be noted that in this game, a target can be afflicted with more than one status effect, meaning you can, if you're especially mean, just dogpile a bunch of status effects onto one unfortunate Pokemon that probably didn't deserve it. Probably. And this is how Mystery Dungeon helps you deal with these different scenarios. Moves that have multiple targets for when you're outnumbered, and various status effects to help you deal with bulky Pokemon to help wear them down. Some status effect moves, like Stun Spore for example, can affect Pokemon in a certain range as well, further making them more useful in a wide variety of different scenarios. But that begs the question, what if your Pokemon can't learn these moves? Sure, just like in standard games, you can have TMs to learn new moves. For example, Piplup can learn Blizzard by a TM, which hits all enemies in the room. Toxic, which, to be fair, I only found out Piplup can learn by checking out its move pool during Gen 4. And also Swagger. Oh yeah, Confusion's a bit of a weird one. It's not classified as a major status effect, but the way it works is pretty cool compared to the mainline series. Normally, you just hit yourself, or, hit your opponent. In this one, it's a bit different. You just hit randomly out of the 8 towers around you. You don't hit yourself, but you can hit your own teammate, which I think is pretty funny. But the problem is though, you're not guaranteed to get those TMs. However, the game does make this a bit more bearable with the introduction of items that can be used during combat. I'm not gonna lie, the only active items I ever used in the standard games were the health restoration items like potions and Moo Moo Milk, and Pokeballs for catching. I never used any of those X stat items. Like X speed or X attack. Never. But with Mystery Dungeon, you get a whole slew of items to use. It feels like the equivalent of Batman's utility belt, but rather than having access to bat-shaped boomerangs, you get bird seeds on these cool blue orbs. Some seeds I like to use include the Stun Seed and the Sleep Seed, which can be thrown at targets. If the target Pokemon is hit by these seeds, they somehow accidentally eat them, and said status effects would apply. Of course, there's also the Reviver Seeds, which, well, revive you. And on top of that, there's the Heal Seed, which gets rid of any status effect you currently have. Orbs, on the other hand, have very specific effects, which are detailed in each of their descriptions. Here's one example. The footage shown on screen captures the moment I got caught off guard by an instant monster house, filled with electric types, while my flying type member is exposed to them. In this case, I used the Spurn Orb, which teleports all Pokemon in the room currently into a random part of the dungeon, allowing us to deal with them all separately. There's also other orbs such as the All Hit Orb, which increases all members' critical hit ratio to its highest limit, and there are many other types of orbs for different scenarios. It should be mentioned that orbs can't be used in any sort of boss encounter, but seeds still can. I'm not gonna lie, I genuinely didn't know we had this many seeds and orbs in the game until I checked the wiki. Like, look at this list. Hello, just cutting in because I forgot to talk about Thorns and Rocks in the original script. These are throwable items that can be used as a ranged alternative to the basic attack. They have fixed damage values, but can increase depending on what type of rock/thorn is thrown. On top of that, they're classified as having a neutral typing. That's right, the throwable rock doesn't count as a rock type move. Not like there's a particular move that, contradicts that, but whatever. The thorns have the same range as the line of sight moves, so if the Pokemon is more than 10 tiles away, it won't reach. Rocks, on the other hand, are pretty weird. The range is apparently still also 10, but all you need to do is face the general direction of the opponent and your aimbot will lock onto the target and hit them from there. I honestly can't believe I forgot to mention this in the original script, as I was spamming them when I was replaying Explorers of Time. Anyway, back to the video. Additionally, some new TMs were added that are unique to Mystery Dungeon. Two that I know of are Vacuum Cut and Wide Slash. These are moves that have ranges that can affect multiple Pokemon. Vacuum Cut deals a fixed amount of damage, which is 17 I think, to all opponents in a room, making this useful in the early game when being outnumbered, and also for the Luxio Tribe fight. And Wide Slash's range is pretty unique. It hits a target that's in front of them, as well as two Pokemon that are adjacent to them, and from memory this deals a fair amount of damage. And the best thing about them is that the TMs can be taught to pretty much almost every Pokemon in the game. In fact, the list of Pokemon that can't learn them is way smaller. So it's clear that they considered different problems we may encounter when it comes to combat, and gave us the necessary tools to be able to overcome them, regardless of what Pokemon you chose for your party. And there it is, the end of the video. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you skipped to this part, please go back and watch the rest of it. Please? No, seriously, please. But I know for a fact this doesn't completely cover everything there is to say about combat. I've not actually completed the post game, so sorry, that's something I definitely need to do. I will probably do that as either a maybe recorded session or a live stream on Twitch, and just to plug in my Twitch, it's the same username, so the Riviera Fish, and the link will be in the description below. But overall though, I do sincerely hope that this is a good first impression as the first video for this channel, and if you did enjoy it, please leave a like and subscribe, and I really hope to see you in the future. Bye bye for now.